Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on the time zone from which you're joining us. My name is Zsuzsanna Magdo. I'm introducing this series in my dual role as Associate Director for the University Pittsburgh Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I also serve as Chair of the Committee for the Advocacy of Diversity and Inclusion at the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. With generous sponsorship from the association and peer centers in the US, this series is now in its third year, having previously centered on themes such as race and intersectionality. Decolonization in focus is this year's theme as we near the one-year anniversary of Russia's war against Ukraine. I invite the audience to join all 6 panels coming up in February and March. Details are available on the program page, which will be shared in the chat for folks joining us via Zoom. All sessions will be live streamed and recorded for future reference in case you should miss any. Before we start, I want to first recognize our colleagues, Chris Martin and Laura Sargent at Harvard University's Davis Center. Without their expertise, dedication, and tireless work, co-organizing and hosting this series would not have been possible. Thank you, Chris and Laura. I'd also like to take this moment to thank our institutional sponsors, including the association and our peer regional studies centers at the universities of Chicago, Wisconsin-Madison, Kansas, Michigan, Texas at Austin, California, Berkeley, as well as Ohio State University, UNC Chapel Hill, and Indiana University, Bloomington. Last but not least, our gratitude also goes to the speakers for answering our call and stepping into this conversation so critical in our field. Today's topic is decolonization. Why does it matter? It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for this session. Tamar Shirinian is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She's a cultural anthropologist who focuses chiefly on queer theory and studies, transnational feminisms, political economy, the processes of post-socialism, psychoanalysis, and more recently, medical and psychological anthropology. Survival of a Perverse Nation is her first book project. In this work, she investigates the intersections of political economy, gender, and sexuality in the post-socialist Republic of Armenia and argues towards a queer theory of political economy that positions late capitalism as a perversion of life. Tamar's research is more wide-ranging, however. She has also explored feminist movements, the 2018 Velvet Revolution, the strategies of fake news in Armenia, the relationship between sexuality and geopolitics, and critical perspectives on imperialism and decolonization in the context of post-socialism. Her most current work investigates social, political, economic, and aesthetic movements of the late 1980s in the Republic of Armenia, through oral histories of those who participated. In this particular project, The Futures of the Past, Tamar is interested in how the imaginaries and hopes of this tumultuous period in the past and the futures dreamed of then might still shape futures imagined in the present. Tamar's work has been published in venues such as American Ethnologist, Gender, Place, and Culture, Polar, Cultural Dynamics, amongst others. Tamar, thank you for shepherding a conversation on why exploring decolonization matters, not only for how we understand the region, but also for how we organize the institutional settings in which research, learning, and policymaking happens. Before I hand it over to Tamar, a bit of housekeeping. Please use Zoom's Q&A function to post questions for the speakers. Questions coming in through YouTube will also be shared with our moderator. Tamar, I think we are ready.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Zsuzsanna, for the introduction. I have the honor today of moderating this conversation and introducing the speakers on our panel entitled Decolonization, Why It Matters. We expect a very interesting discussion today, about which I am very excited. Our first presenter is Marina Mogilner, who will be followed by Svetlana Biadarieva, who will be followed by Ep Anus. Marina Mogilner holds Edward and Mariana Thaden Chair in Russian and East European Intellectual History at University of Illinois at Chicago. She is also a founding co-editor of Ab Imperio Quarterly, dedicated to new imperial history and studies of nationalism in the post-Soviet space. Her most recent books include Homo Imperii, A History of Physical Anthropology in Russia, out from University of Nebraska Press in 2013, A Race for the Future, Scientific Visions of Modern Russian Jewishness from Harvard University Press in 2022, an edited volume, A Cultural History of Race in the Age of Empire and Nation State, 1760 to 1920. For the 6-volume Bloomsbury series, A Cultural History of Race from Bloomsbury Academic 2021, and Jews, Race and the Politics of Difference, the case of Vladimir Jabotinsky against the Russian Empire from Indiana University Press in 2023. Mogilner has published widely in various journals and collections on topics such as race and empire, history of human sciences in the Russian Empire, and so on. Dr. Mogilner, I will leave it to you to start.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you to organizers of this series and this panel in particular. And I want to start with acknowledging that at the latest ACES convention and also in the months that followed the convention, there was a lot of discussions of decolonization, and decolonization has become almost a buzzword, a kind of a slogan used by many of us in the field without really a clear meaning attached to this slogan. And so my own, obviously, very incomplete analysis of the most recent online and offline conversations about decolonization suggests that there are a few kind of recurrent usages, which I'm going to summarize here. So first of all, decolonization as a call for political action, often with references to Fanon, but really without a clearly defined vision of what such a political action would entail with regard to the situation in our field. Then there is a call to reconstitute our field by decentering Russian focus and introducing more, national kind of histories, literary subfields, and so on. And this is a legitimate affirmative action form of decolonization, but I believe that we also should to kind of articulate and reflect on possible implications of this form of decolonization, because the result of this decolonization may well be a triumph of methodological nationalism and fracturing of the field along these national lines. Moreover, as we know, national narratives themselves are exclusionary, and they produce their own forms of silencing, of marginalization, and eventually of colonization. So the next recurrent usage of decolonization calls for historiographic reflection and some self-searching within the field in order to locate those initial sources of colonizing patterns of thought and narratives. And from a perspective of a historian, I can say that this is definitely the way that I see as very productive, absolutely necessary. But in practice, what I've observed so far is that this kind of reflection tends to focus on late 19th century, early 20th century sources in historiography, for example, on Kluchevsky, or on the founders of Russian studies in the US, such as Karpovich, rather than on the, say, late Cold War generation of scholars who developed some patterns of knowledge production and made political choices that continue to frame our field today. So I think that in this regard, this type of decolonization appears to be much less self-reflective and self-critical than it potentially can be. Finally, another very influential and very loud trend in this decolonization talk is represented by the calls to abandon, cancel, abandon everything deemed Russian. And in my field in particular, Russian archives, Russian topics, and refocus on the studies of diaspora, of global communities, and also on Western archives. And obviously, Russian archives and unfortunately Ukrainian archives are inaccessible at the moment. But this kind of decolonization talk is driven more by political and ideological considerations. So we don't have to, we can't deal with, Putin's regime, which is identified with Russian, and so that's why we have to make this important decisions to really restructure the way we produce knowledge in the field. So this is only a very general overview of semantic and political incoherency of the current decolonization talk. And my main problem with it is that if the conversation continues along these lines only, the end of the war, and I believe that Ukraine will prevail, and I think Ukraine should prevail, but the end of the war eventually will put an end to this decolonization talk simply because the political urgency that drives this talk will disappear. And so this is my fear, and this is my main concern. Moreover, from the experience of post-colonial studies, we know that even when decolonization is taking a step further and becomes a really serious kind of epistemological effort, epistemological work, it still can produce a powerful critical discourse, but not a viable positive alternative, again, beyond methodological nationalism. Think about Chakrabarty's call to decenter Europe, which resonates with our own call, right, to decenter Russia from the studies in the field. So Chakrabarty's own generation of post-colonial theories, such as Homi Bhabha, such as Gyan Prakash, and others, have offered a profoundly pessimistic response to this challenge. They just don't deem such a decentering possible. Hence, they turn to an ahistorical mode of writing and thinking about the past. They retreat to spaces of authenticity and their never-ending critique of Western modernity, or just modernity full stop, which is Western by definition. So, and as Frederick Cooper has pointed out, instead of decentering Europe, such efforts only contribute to keeping the hyper-real Europe alive. So I argue that if decolonization is to be taken seriously as a framework to rethink and reconstitute our field beyond this immediate political urgency, we should start with clarifying its meaning. What do we mean by decolonization, and the goals that we want to achieve? And for this, as a first step, it makes sense to critically revisit the baggage of post-colonial theory to avoid repeating the same mistake and reinventing the wheel, and also to make sure that this wave of decolonization coming from our region brings something new to the table and not really reiterate the same circle of debates. And by mistakes that I think we can avoid and should avoid, I mean the trap of methodological nationalism as a response to colonialism, the embrace of ahistoricity and a no agency position, like accepting that subaltern can't speak, just, can't, that's it. The retreat to spaces of purity and authenticity, the reliance on rigid binaries such as colonizers and colonized, construed ahistorically, acontextually, without being able to account for complexities of colonial and imperial situations, the dismissal of hybridity as a condition possible as per Homi Bhabha only within the hegemonic discourse, and so on. That said, my own understanding of decolonization has been formed by the body of post-colonial scholarship and theories that have proved that structures of epistemological domination are enduring and real, and they persist well after the political decolonization is accomplished. Hence, epistemological work on our own analytical categories and our established basic narratives is required to complete our politically and ideologically motivated decolonizing and decentering. So my understanding of decolonization prioritizes defamiliarizing and historicizing new categories that we use, such as Europe, nation, modernity, empire, gender, race, colonialism, Russian, Ukrainian, Armenian, and other seemingly self-evident categories that frame our analysis. Moreover, I argue that such a defamiliarizing should include disentangling of these categories from any stable and especially, contemporary groupness conceived meta-historically. Then the next step should be reconnecting them contextually, avoiding using categories of practice as our own categories of analysis. Next, as a representative of new imperial history and the other imperial collectives that develops this approach within the field of Northern Eurasian and Eastern European studies, I believe one category that can help us sustain a shared conversation in the field and avoid locking ourselves within those narrow national cages should be empire. As such, this category had also undergone scrutiny within the post-colonial tradition, from Baladier's totality of colonial situation to theories of developmentalist imperialism, to the most recent explications of imperial debris and the persistence of empire under the gaze of capitalism and globalism. The history of our region, just as the history of the world at large, has developed within imperial formation. Even, the post-Soviet nation states inherited diverse imperial societies whose members could combine a sense of belonging to a post-Soviet nation with split national loyalties, with multilingualism, with mixed ethnic origin and cultural hybridity. So reflecting on this complexity and longevity of empire, newer scholarship has rejected, simplistic post-colonial binaries, and I'm thinking here about Burbank's and Cooper empires in world history, Judson, the Habsburg Empire, Ab Imperio collective, 2 volumes, Northern Eurasian, on Northern Eurasian history. So the new imperial history in particular has transformed empire into a category of analysis that does not necessarily coincide with every specific historical empire, but affords a language to discuss a national, hierarchical, unevenly and irregularly structured and organized societies and polities. There is nothing strange about using empire as an analytical category. Think about nation that we do not use today as a kind of a natural attribute of a group, right? That we speak about imagined nations and constructed, we historicize, contextualize, and diversify. Empire as an imperial formation or imperial situation, that is, empire as an analytical category, offers a context for reconsidering and reassembling our field, whether we study political processes, Soviet modernization, Pushkin as a poet in the Russian Empire who expressed his imperial vision in Russian, or Taras Shevchenko as an imperial cultural figure and a poet and prophet of an anti-imperial Ukrainian nationalism, and so on. Empire as a context-setting category for any study, from modernity to subjectivity, from transition, from pre-1917 to Soviet imperial formation, or from Soviet imperial formation to post-Soviet regime, makes one monological explanation, one monological narrative, after all, just one language as of study, inadequate. Also it makes visible, it exposes structural conditions of inequality and domination, but also hybridity and overlap of categories of groupness and belonging. So to complete, to conclude, empire as an analytical concept and as a context-setting category, in my view, is required for re-examining of our big narratives, of blind zones, of our analytical repertoire and our research questions. And I personally call for this kind of epistemological decolonization and decentering that would have a lasting impact on knowledge production in our field, on the ways the field is organized and structured institutionally, and also I hope on how we train scholars in our field. So this is my understanding of decolonization, and I believe that this is what this latest wave of decolonial critique and thought and scholarship can contribute to what we already have in our repertoire to enable the actual decolonizing effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Moginer. Our next speaker is Dr. Svetlana Bieldieva, who is an art historian, curator, and artist. Her current research focus is contemporary Ukrainian art, decoloniality, and Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. She also works on selected topics in Eastern European and Latin American art. She holds a PhD in history of art from the Courtauld Institute of Art at the University of London. She's the editor of Contemporary Ukrainian and Baltic Art, Political and Social Perspectives, 1991 to 2021, out in 2021. And co-editor of At the Frontline, Ukrainian Art, 2013 to 2019, out in 2020. She has published critical texts on Ukrainian art in such academic and media outlets as October, Art Margins Online, Post at MoMA, Revue Critique d'Art, Burlington Contemporary, Financial Times, and the Art newspaper, among others. In 2022, she was selected as the CEC Arts Link International Fellow in collaboration with the University of Kansas, the non-resident visiting fellow at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the George Washington University. In 2023, she will be the George F. Keenan Fellow at the Keenan Institute at the Wilson Center. Currently, she works on a monograph, Ambi-Coloniality and War, the Ukrainian-Russian Case, from Palgrave Macmillan, 2023, coming out this year. Dr. Bieldieva, I invite you to take up. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me to talk today at this panel, which addresses this very important and urgent topic of decolonization. And today I'm going to talk briefly about my perspective on decolonizing Ukrainian art history in research and teaching, both internationally and locally within Ukraine. And I would like to start with the premise that the ongoing Russian neo-colonial war on Ukraine brought attention to Ukraine's low visibility in academic studies internationally. That was some kind of unexpected side effect of the escalation of this war. Art history bibliographies that consider Ukraine in many cases refer to an academic interest in Soviet studies developed since the 1970s, 1980s, but do not reflect on contemporary situation. In looking at today's syllabi of top world universities teaching Eastern European art history, I noticed two trends. First trend is that if the art of as well that of other that we can find numerous examples. Second, the lack of contemporary English language texts on Ukrainian art draws attention to literature that focuses on Ukrainian art as attributing artists and entire art movements that were active in the territory of contemporary Ukraine to the Russian art scene. And this we can find not only in literature, but is quite widespread problem in museum practice as well, because many of international museums, including those Western museums in Europe and in the United States, actually place Ukrainian artists who were born on the territory of either a Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. Somehow they interpret them as Russian artists. And this is a problem that has been addressed since the last year. It hasn't been addressed by Ukrainian art historians and curators in order to change this narrative. And thanks to their efforts, this narrative is changing in museum practice. These misconceptions are the result of long-term priority given to English language Russian studies at the expense of the visibility of other post-Soviet regional studies, not only Ukrainian. Area studies of the post-Soviet space have been peripheral until recently, when the Russian war on Ukraine brought misunderstandings about Ukrainian studies to the forefront. Moreover, they emphasize the presence of Russian imperialism in ways of interpretation and perspectives enveloped by the post-Soviet focus. The standard for post-Soviet and Eastern European art history in Eurasian teaching became obsolete after 2014. And this is my proposal that these standards, they became obsolete also because of the outbreak of the war in 2014, and also because of in Ukraine locally, because of the events of Euromaidan, which brought kind of tectonic shifts in construction of our vision of culture and construction of cultural institutions, and kind of more globally, looking, it brought about the idea of final dismantling of post-Soviet space. Now, art history, as applied to Ukraine, remains one of the most underdeveloped fields due to the lack of visual material, challenges to archival access, and a general shortage of programs in Ukrainian art history at both the undergraduate and postgraduate levels. The circle of specialists who work in 20th and 21st century Ukrainian art history is very narrow. And we can observe this in both teaching and research outside and within Ukraine, where the relevant educational framework is still being constructed, is still under construction, as well as in, it also, we can observe it in the post-Soviet visions on art present both in methodology and research interests. That is why it is important to decolonize our perspectives on Ukrainian art in order to reinforce the discipline of Ukrainian art history. With respect to the second trend that I mentioned of Russian culture appearing in many texts as enveloping Ukrainian art and culture, let me briefly discuss how Russia's appropriation of the Ukrainian avant-garde has been incorporated into English language research on art. In addition to a disproportionately strong focus on Russian art of the 20th and 21st centuries that is visible in Slavic art history studies, the emphasis on what is seen as Russian art is often distorted in appropriative form. For example, the influential book, The Total Art of Stalinism by Boris Groys, that was published in English as early as 1992 and in German in 1988, the author compares Kazimir Malevich to a, quoting, typical hero of 19th century Russian philanthropic literature, depicting the vision of Malevich by the artist Ilya Kabakov as Akakiy Akakievich striving for absolute void and perishing in the undertaking, much as Gogol's hero yearned for the expensive overcoat and befitting his rank. Here, the framing of the entire discourse goes through a presumably Russian cultural lens. However, it completely omits the fact that Nikolai, or in Ukrainian version, Mykola Gogol, was born in and wrote a large part of his works about the Ukrainian Poltava Governorate. Ilya Kabakov is a native of Dnipropetrovsk, now Dnipro, in central eastern Ukraine. And finally, Kiev-born Kazimir Malevich, with his work and legacy divided between current-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, is hardly fitting to be representative of Russian 19th century literature. It would be, of course, incorrect to interpret discourses based on formal qualities of the places of birth, or even worse, ethnic origins of authors involved in them, but my emphasis here is different. It is that certain key discourses are eliminated when applying a single cultural framework that intentionally or unintentionally overlooks local contexts and sensitivities as a result of centuries-long colonization. Other examples of when Ukrainian artists appear under the label of Russian avant-garde typically include names like Nathan Altman, born in Vinnytsia, Alexandra Ekster, born in Białystok in Poland and extensively worked in Kiev, and David Burlyuk, who was born in Kharkiv Governorate, among many others. And the recent debate, for example, of the postponing of the exhibition at the Cooper Union on Futemas also contributes precisely to this discussion. The decentered identities of contemporary artists, because I work mostly with contemporary art, signifies that researching and teaching late Soviet unofficial art, for example, becomes an even more difficult task with artists taking different positions as to their belonging. For example, Odessa conceptualism and Moscow conceptualism are often regarded through the same lens, when the artists themselves at times struggle to place their art in a particular paradigm. Once finding Moscow as their main working and marketing location, they had difficulties with reframing their art produced locally in Odessa in the Ukrainian context, and so do art historians and art critics. The term Odessa conceptualism is relatively new, and it mimics the metaphor of Moscow romantic conceptualism coined by Groys. Similarly, the work of Odessa artists has been largely seen as the offspring of the Moscow art scene, and its existence as an independent phenomenon has even been disputed. The art historic chronology, however, tells us exactly the opposite. The work of Odessa conceptualist artists in their home city since late 1970s preceded their subsequent impact on the Moscow art scene, which occurred already in the mid-1980s. This shift, as well as the expanded focus on their work locally in Ukraine, is hardly reflected in any existing literature, which is generally scarce, that would focus directly on the phenomenon of Odessa conceptualism. The only recent exhibition that also produced a catalog, Enfant Terrible, at the Mistetsky Arsenal in Kiev in 2015, provoked a debate on Odessa's arts belonging. Such an approach that I'm describing results in flattening the complex narrative of localized art histories into a synthetic historiography that manifests belonging to the domain of Russian culture. I could call such an approach metonymical, that focuses on one set of formal characteristics For example, artists working in the territory of the Russian Empire and subsequently in the USSR, while omitting others that link them to local context. Postcolonial theory uses the term metonymic gap rather differently, marking it as a cultural discrepancy formed when appropriations of a colonial language insert allusions and references from a first native language, which is already unknown to readers. In this case, these references to Ukrainian culture visible in the works by artists of Ukrainian origin are equally accessible, yet invisible for readers educated within colonial academic framework, including those in Western academia, which also shows how far the colonial entanglement has reached over decades and centuries. The reasons for Ukrainian art history's invisibility, both internationally and locally, are complex and cannot be reduced to one underlying matter. The historical reasons include the physical elimination of key Ukrainian artists and writers. Taken as example, the 1930s executed Renaissance, when numerous Ukrainian artists and writers were killed by the Stalinist regime, including nearly the entire circle of Mikhailo Boychuk. And also the repressions of the 60th generation, including the unresolved murder of Alla Horska in 1970, and the subsequent destruction of artistic works in both cases. The important contemporary social factor that affects the local development of art history studies and teaching, but also projects onto academia internationally, is the apparent lack of institutional development in the education of art history inside Ukraine. Maybe my Ukrainian colleagues will not agree, but I think that most of existing programs use largely outdated frameworks in teaching art history. We can mention such frameworks as Мистецтвознавство, which is a combination of art history and art theory, or культурология, which is practically cultural studies, which often appear as too generalized in their ambition to study both history and theory of art and address Soviet methodologies of teaching, or post-Soviet methodologies of teaching. Restructuring the current art history education in Ukraine and the expansion of financing of art history research are crucial. These processes, however, are not among Ukraine's priorities in the absence of a well-rounded strategy for cultural development. Quality scholarly research and production of art history texts in Ukrainian art, which could also be translated in English and included in the university syllabi globally, remains an urgent necessity. So the problem also appears not just from outside perspective, but from the inside. To decolonize art history research on Ukraine, a sequence of important steps is required. First, art history scholars, among others, must detach from seeing contemporary Ukrainian culture as part of a unified post-Soviet cultural space and step back from the post-colonial vision of it. While the post-colonial perspective, as I understand it, denotes the situation immediately following the colonial experience, taking on implications of colonialism of the past with the intention of reinterpreting them and recombining them. The decolonial situation points to the final process of dismantling the colonial narrative. This includes a transition from post-colonial slow cultural transformation, which includes this recombination that I mentioned, to a rapid decolonial cultural shift. The strategies of step-by-step change as a transfiguration of post-Soviet space, which have been effective in the first 2 decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, proved to contribute to the neo-imperial stance undertaken by Russia since 2014, and therefore require immediate action. The final dismantling of post-Soviet space that was initiated by the aggression in 2014 found its culmination after the full-scale invasion began in February 2022. The post-colonial situation in Ukraine has been further replaced by the processes of decolonial release after 2022. And this radical change must be reflected in tectonic shifts in academic research and teaching as well. Here, to conclude my presentation, I find it useful to refer to art historian Piotr Petrovsky's famous definition of horizontal art histories, which calls to consider every local art scene individually in its own social and political context. Petrovsky proposed applying a nonlinear, diffuse, and polyphonic model to the context of local histories, as opposed to hierarchical vertical art history, which divides the field into centers and peripheries of art production. For example, we need to accept that Ukrainian art history is crafted from notions and visualities belonging to different ideologies, once suppressed cultural elements and distorted identities, each proper for its location, kind of regional location and cultural differences. The collision of these individual aspects has produced a new cultural reality that is still on many occasions uneven, and the decolonial processes aim to unify it and give equal visibility to all the elements. The emergence of these elements and their establishment in the public culture has been guided by the growth of new institutions after the Euromaidan, and at the same time, the elaboration of new independent artistic languages and idioms of art criticism between 2014 and 2022, and until 2023, the situation of today. The production of new narratives in these idioms and subsequent incorporation of them into research and study programs of art history and cultural history, among others, and the institutional support to this process, both locally and internationally, is the first step to the decolonization of the field. Thank you very much. Here I finish my presentation, and I look forward to comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bidreva. Our next speaker is Ep Anus, who is an associate professor at Tallinn University Institute of Humanities in Estonia and a lecturer at the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures at Ohio State University. Dr. Anus received her PhD from the University of Tartu in Estonia. As a post-colonial, decolonial scholar, she is interested in the complex ideological entanglements of the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. Her recent books include Soviet Post-Colonial Studies, A View from the Western Borderlands, out from Routledge in 2018, and Coloniality, Nationality, Modernity, a post-colonial view on Baltic cultures under Soviet rule, edited by her, out from Routledge in 2018. She is also an author or co-author of 3 monographs and 3 collective volumes in Estonian. Her current project, The Politics of Eco-Intimacy, Constructing Subjecthood in the Soviet-Era Baltics, explores connections and linkages between eco-intimacy, the feeling of belonging together with one's natural surroundings, and models of subjectivity in the Soviet period and the subsequent era of transition. Her work in progress also includes a comparative analysis of Soviet and post-Soviet post-colonial literatures and a book chapter about neoliberal revolutionaries in the late 1980s Estonian SSR. In addition to her work as a scholar, she has published 2 novels, some poetry, and several children's books. Dr. Anus, I will leave it to you. You are muted.
Hello, everyone. And I also have some slides for you, which is probably good since I'm the third and everyone probably already is a little bit, absent-minded. I start with Edward Said. Everything about human history is rooted in the earth. And I start with Said because I'm thinking here rather concretely also in terms of classroom situations and maybe how we could address the questions of decolonization, our field, in the classroom right now. I'm also myself preparing a graduate class on these matters right now. And Said is very accessible. So I think it's a good place to to start, even if we want to criticize some of his ideas. So I call for decolonization with attentiveness to questions of land, to ecosocial relations, the natural cultural continuum, colonial ecological violence. So today, when we face both Russia's new wave of imperial, neocolonial warfare, and also when we face anthropogenic climate change, I propose that we should combine these two problems and address these together. So the ongoing climate crisis obliges us to activate in our classrooms a deeper understanding of the intertwining of human ideas, lives, and actions with natural environments. And we can use this approach also in decolonizing Slavic, East European, Eurasian studies. At the same time, in order to plot any kind of decolonization strategies, we need to understand, first of all, histories of colonialism and imperialism in our contexts. So let's go back to Said. At some very basic level, I quote Said again, imperialism means thinking about settling on, controlling land that you do not possess, that is distant, that is lived on and owned by others. So Said connects, of course, imperialism with land. And here I would note that in case of Said and many other thinkers, imperialism and colonialism are quite interchangeable. We could here just switch from imperialism to colonialism in this quote, and it would make perhaps even more sense. And colonialism, coming from Latin cholera, does have this root connecting it to cultivation. Thus, I guess, a logical connection with territorial control. But I would argue that we should also need to extend that to questions of care, to the metaphysics of belonging, to an ethics of indigeneity. And this is a process that I think is just at the very beginning in decolonial, post-colonial studies more generally. So our field could contribute here in quite interesting ways. And of course, decolonizing our field started already in 1990s. Those of us in cultural studies might know Marco Pavlichen's Violetta Kellerto's article. And in 2000s, there was already a big array of different writings that came out. And let me just remind you of Catherine Werder's work with about socialism and her emphasis on the question of inscription of the colonial system on the bodies of subjects, for example. And then also this roundtable from 2005, where Vitaly Chernetsky, Nancy Condi, Harsha Ram, and Gayatri Spivak addressed these issues. I was myself a baby scholar at that time, but I would love to hear some impressions about this particular roundtable one day. So I would also propose that perhaps it's good to have some terms, some definitions, just to even to dispute them as a starting point, especially in our classroom discussions. And let me just propose a few. First of all, colonialism can be defined as a political, economic, and cultural system of domination over a nation or a region by a culturally, ethnically, and linguistically different nation or imperial entity. And there is one by Kaori Nagai, which stresses the cultural, linguistic, and religious structures that are also involved. And let us also not forget the colonial attitudes and colonial discourses and how these entail unresponsiveness or a derogatory attitude towards cultural towards local cultures and local ethnicities. And they proceed from a sense of cultural difference and cultural superiority supported by colonial power structures. And I give as an example here this poster from the Stalin era Estonia, which promotes the advancing towards communism under the great leadership of Stalin. However, interestingly, Estonia is missing in this lack. So it's such a visual, great representation of becoming invisible. This was just a format that was used all over the Soviet Union, and they didn't care if particular places would be even marked in that map or not. And then also that Kevin Platt's remark on how in post-Soviet context, discussions of Latvian educational policies are most often couched in terms of relative inferiority of Latvian civilization by comparison with Russian civilization, which possesses universally recognized worldwide significance. That would be about the continuation of these same attitudes, which date, of course, back to earlier decades. And then just a few, again, reminders that could be useful to discuss in the classroom. Gayatri Spivak's notion that every postcoloniality is situated and therefore different. There's no proper model of colonialism, and we shouldn't look for one. These are historically evolving phenomenon. These power structures change over time in relation to local circumstances, including local social relations, but they also change in relation to global processes. And another reminder, the era of late colonialism is different from 19th century. So we shouldn't compare Soviet era to 19th century British Empire and say like, wow, this looks different. So that's not an empire then. And so we might say that the USSR was an empire in times when the international prestige of empires had diminished, and it could be understood as a colonialism camouflage. Yet what was definitely present there was this paternalistic rhetoric of cultural superiority and the central claim that the great Russian nation is coming to uplift other nations and ethnicities. And I have an example from Pravda here with these declarations of Veliki Ruski Narod. And David Brandenberger has this really nice formulation about the orientalization of non-Russian peoples in the Stalin era. I quote him here: "Non-Russians were collectively cast as if frozen in time, forever clad in furs and exotic pre-modern textiles, and surrounded with obsolete tools and field implements." So also a couple of more reminders. Continental colonialism differs from overseas colonialism. And I recommend this book called Shifting Forms of Continental Colonialism. And then what I think it might be quite interesting to explore in classroom situations is colonialism as a comparative phenomenon, how there are different hierarchies of colonialisms, how that comparisons, how they imitate each other, how empires imitate each other, how there are competitions. And here we get all this idea of Russian Empire as a second-rate empire, which is formulated by many scholars in different ways, starting with Madina Tlostano, Slava Morozov, Ab Imperia Group, and others. And I like very much these formulations by Nick Breifogel, Abby Schrader, and Willard Sunderland about 19th century Russian imperialism, how 19th century Russian officials referred to the Amur River as the Russian Mississippi and the Caucasus as our Algeria. So I quote them: "The Russians in charge of colonization at the time were self-consciously comparing and contrasting Russian settlement and colonial power to what they observed in other states. And a few more reminders. Colonialism is often layered. Also, let's also mention that colonial rule must employ local elites. I have an image of Juhan Smuul, the Estonian author who actually never properly learned how to speak Russian. Okay. In my own slide, something changed now. Sorry if I, yes, and I'm not sure how you're seeing my slides, but I myself, I'm not seeing them similarly anymore. Let me just stop share and very quickly start again. Sorry about this. So, yes, just a second. Yes, colonialism as not necessarily always economical exploitation, but that the fundamental aspect would be a long distance decision making, even though these decisions might well be uninformed. The point is that local interest and knowledge are not given due weight. And then national essentialism, I think this is connected to Marina's methodological nationalism, but I would also propose that colonialism itself produces national essentialism, and it does produce strong us and them juxtapositions. So we might say that we want to get rid of binarism, etc. But if you look at just the historical situations, the fact is that during these colonial eras, there were very, very strong oppositions between us and them. And of course, that is quite problematic. It brings in new sets of problems in the era of decolonization. But we can't just ignore the existence of these. And I would also stress that we should also take into account the multidirectionality of all societies. There's never only one ideology that defines the era. We can talk about empires and their colonial regimes of power. At the same time, there is also a question of modernity versus coloniality. There's a question of how these intermingle with different national discourses. And colonial rule is not the only defining factor in a society or in people's lives. Personal experience is always more complex than the political regime of the era. And I myself am now interested in this context in the multiscalarity of the singular human subject, how the human subject is formed through encounters with all kinds of matter, both living and non-living, and is not only informed by state ideology of any kind. So here we might ask, does a colonial matrix of power inform all levels of subjectivity? Does decolonization need to decolonize even sense perception? And this is something I leave open again. I think it would be a good classroom discussion. And I also would like to refer to how ecosocial connections and colonial ecological violence are tied with imperial difference. And again, these are questions that we can address when talking about decolonizing the field. But I will finish here. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Annus. We've heard from all three of our speakers and lots of interesting threads to think about. And I'm really excited to have all of you as an interlocutor on this conversation. I've been kind of thinking along with all of you as you've been speaking, and kind of I want to pull out some of the threads as well as some of the debates that have emerged in what you've all been saying. First, I want to kind of think about how, at least within the US and in scholarship in the US and within American studies, as well as within the larger US Academy today, how decolonization is being theorized. And of course, as Dr. Mogina reminds us, is not always theorized. Sometimes it's just kind of put out there. It's used. You referred to it as a slogan. And I think that's spot on. That is often what is happening, but it is also often theorized. And when it is theorized, at least in my reading, we get three main schools of thought. The primal one, I should say the primary one that we get today is on settler colonialism, and of course, which is very apt in the context of the United States, which is a settler colony. And that's coming from scholars such as Patrick Wolf, who's theorized settler colonialism as different from other forms of colonization, as being organized through the logic of elimination. So colonialism of the land, take the land, which means that the people and the histories of that land have to be eliminated. But within this, the kind of the theories which emerge from taking settler colonialism as a primary form of colonialism, it's land that gets prioritized. So in Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang's work, we get the sense that if we are not talking about land, the taking of another's land, if we are not talking about the taking of something very material like life, then we shouldn't kind of think about that as colonialism or colonization. And if we are not thinking about giving that back, then we shouldn't be using the term decolonization, because then what happens is we are metaphorizing or making metaphor out of what should actually be a material process. We also have some older forms of colonial or decolonial thinking, decolonization, and in this framework, we, largely it's through Frantz Fanon's work, who of course was someone who participated in decolonization movements, was not just a scholar and a psychoanalyst, but was also very much involved himself in militarized forms of decolonization. And so when I think of Fanon's work, I'm thinking about national liberation movements, the actual often militarized liberation of people from colonial entities and empire, right? And here we might also think about Césaire, Aimé Césaire, who also comes from a psychoanalytic tradition and is also thinking very much about colonialism as something that might involve violence in the way that Fanon is thinking about as decolonization, but in a way that might involve something more psychically violent as well, right? Kind of undoing the subject, which is also, we get that in Fanon's work as well. So kind of centering processes of violence, of something radically undoing a sense of self and undoing the world as we know it, sometimes through, death, causing death, as decolonization in that tradition. There are, from what I'm kind of picking out from what you're all saying, there's other threads and other ways in which we might think about decolonization, and not just as the giving back of land, not just as the giving back of life that has been taken, not as kind of doing logics of entire elimination, but possibly undoing forms of erasure that have happened historically. I'm also seeing some debates that are coming out. Dr. Moginer wants us to think about kind of decolonization as a process of radically undoing the epistemologies that we've inherited, largely inherited from imperial structures, right? So how we think about some of these categories, the colonized, the colonizer, and the main category that you used in your talk today was empire, how we might think about empire critically, not in the ways in which we've inherited the term from imperial structures, but rather how we might think empire that does not belong to those structures, but that helps us think critically about those structures themselves. And in that vein, Dr. Mogina, what I saw you kind of what I heard you doing is thinking about how we have to take those histories seriously in ways that we, take that don't erase them or deny their existence, but rather incorporate them in our understanding critically from the present. So it's not about denying the fact that we have epistemological structures that have endured political empires, but that those epistemological structures are still very much with us, and how we might think within them to get outside of them. Dr. Biedreva, I heard you saying something very different, and here I'd be interested in hearing more from both of you in regard to this debate, or maybe it's not a debate and I've heard incorrectly, that in order to really decolonize art history of Ukraine or art history in the region writ large, we really should actually move beyond that imperial structure of thinking about Ukrainian art or other art within the post-Soviet region as belonging to a shared culture of a post-Soviet region, or maybe even problematically what comes out of the West as a Russian art or a Russian culture. And of course, that in itself is also borrowed from the Western, academia, right? So it's not necessarily a problem, if I'm hearing correctly, coming out of the region itself, but the issue of Western scholars, largely, I think I heard in your work, American scholars who've been thinking about Ukrainian art as Russian art. So it's a kind of double colonization or double erasure that's taking place through these various steps of erasure. So that presents a debate, as in should we kind of think beyond empire, or think beyond the ways in which a shared Soviet world or even a shared imperial Russian world has impacted the present, and kind of think about these two things split historically at the current moment in order to come up with perhaps a new subject of Ukrainian art, right? And that might be in keeping with a kind of Fanonian project of a new subject, but in some ways, what I hear you doing is also calling for not historicizing being a place where some of that erasure might be coming from. I also wanted to kind of link what I hear Dr. Anus kind of giving us to think about decolonization in these different ways, and how that might help us think about these questions of land, of material worlds, in different ways. So here we're not thinking about not thinking about the logic of elimination and giving land back as decolonization, but what you're pointing to as colonialism or imperialism as the domination of land also has another intellectual history with social ecologists. So I'm thinking here about Murray Bookchin, Janet Beale, and others who've tried to think about human domination of humans, or class domination or gender domination, as being embedded within the domination of humans on Earth. So how we might think about, that body of thought, social ecology, which is not typically thought of as a kind of decolonization theory, right? And is certainly at the moment not necessarily hip or trendy within academia either, right? It's fallen largely out of fashion, but how we might bring that back to think about decolonization as perhaps a social ecology. I'm also hearing in some of your work the question of sovereignty as taking center stage. Sovereignty was something that we, at least in my discipline in anthropology, we had been thinking about a lot for about a decade in the early 2000s, and again fell out of fashion, and decolonization came to take focus again. And I'm wondering what, questions about sovereignty or perhaps critical perspectives on sovereignty, self-sovereignty, sexual sovereignty, land sovereignty, and all of these other ways to think about decision-making power as the space from which to decolonize, rather than thinking about decolonization as this big kind of, there has to be colonialism or imperialism or some other such thing to decolonize, because I think sovereignty is a much more porous and plastic category about decision making that might help us think beyond this kind of sloganist decolonization. One of the questions that I also had that I was wondering about as you were all speaking is the role of Europe and the role of the US in how we think about colonialism, imperialism, as well as decolonization in the region of Eastern Europe and Eurasia. I find it interesting that in many ways, Europe, the US, the West didn't come up, considering two things. First, that for a lot of people within this region, or at least, in Armenia, where I do my research, when we're thinking about decolonization up until recently, we were usually thinking about the West, right? So and that is largely because, and of course, for the right wing, the West was the kind of focus of any kind of question of colonization or decolonization, because of cultural colonialism and imperialism, and human rights as colonialism, and feminism and LGBT rights and all of these things as coming from the West and trying to destroy local culture, which is of course a completely absurd kind of way of thinking about colonialism. But from the left perspective in Armenia, the West has always been at the center of thinking about colonialism and decolonization because of historical trends like the Washington Consensus, which is largely responsible for the complete political economic destruction of Armenia, as well as various other republics that are now post-Soviet republics. And so when we think about how what was a kind of world that Armenians kind of lived in was destroyed, it was destroyed not because of Russia, but because of the West, and it's again not necessarily violent or military exploitation, but economic exploitation. And in the contemporary world, if we look at what are the flows of capital in this region, what are the economic decision-making powers in this region, it is largely coming from, at least in some parts of this region of this world, Europe and the US. So just to kind of reflect on that. And is there a way that we might think about decolonization in this part of the world that currently has, in decision-making power has been put in the hands of Russia, or Russia is taking it through various means, but that doesn't necessarily exempt the other kind of part of the Cold War as having its hands in this too. So how we might think in more complex terms about what colonialism or imperialism might look like here. And Dr. Enus, this is what I see in the kind of the multi-scalarity, as well as like having to think about multiple perspectives in terms of the colonial subject that you were kind of talking about in the latter parts of your talk today. And I will So I'll just leave it at the question is how do you all kind of think about how we might have to re-reflect on the question of decolonization in the region of Eastern Europe and Eurasia, considering the fact that its political, economic, as well as cultural and aesthetic and epistemological histories and contemporary contexts are very different from where colonial theory, decolonial theory, and all of these other frameworks were inherited for us. Thank you.
Marina, would you like to go first?
I can. Thank you, Tamar, for this amazing, not just summary, but really I feel like the conversation, the real conversation is really beginning just now with all the complexities and like implicit and explicit contradictions in our takes on decolonization being so well presented by Tamar. I have a lot to say in response to your Tamar observations and questions and my colleagues' contributions. Some of the most important things, I think, is that, as you pointed out, there are many genealogies of post-colonial thought. And yes, kind of American tradition of post-colonial thinking is very different from French tradition and from what we can probably designate as this emerging body of scholarship coming from our region. And in American case, you also have race and the race talk been prominently present in defining decolonization, which is not the case in Eurasian Eastern European scholarship. There are, I think this is a big problem that we have also to consider. But one thing that I think was kind of present in your comment and in some other comments here today is that in some approaches to decolonization, especially the most kind of politically charged approach, there is this implicit idea that you can redo history, that you can really jump from like post-colonial condition to pre-colonial condition and correct things. And so this kind of generates another erasure by trying to fix this problem with particular people, particular experiences, particular voices being erased to kind of reproduce or produce another major erasure. And so this, I think, is something that we should be aware of when we imagine our new approaches, narratives, and offer solutions to those predicaments. My main problem with many of the solutions that were presented today is the erasure or the simplification, kind of reduction of the entire Soviet experience as colonial. And so there is this huge literature right now on the Soviet imperial formation and all the implicit contradictions that were there from the very beginning. The Soviet project was an anti-imperial and anti-colonial project, while at the same time it's kind of reproduced structures of colonial domination. And these two trends coexisted within this project from the very beginning. It's never was one against the other. It was always, both tendencies present. As a kind of imperial formation, this was, if we use, Franz and Hirsch definition, the empire of nation. So it was a structure that very consciously deployed Marxist evolutionism, recognizing that the national stage of development is absolutely key to arriving to this post-national stage. So just claiming that this was, the colonial project that then created a kind of a post-colonial condition, even in political terms, would be, I think, a simplification, because we have recognized that this really was an imperial formation, but this was a new kind of an imperial formation that at the same time produced those kind of national, political, and cultural forms that, and this is, I think, part of the post-colonial agenda that then were able to generate their own senses and kind of visions and developmental patterns that were not directly determined by the structures and even the hegemonic language generated by the Soviet Empire. And so to me, just, to kind of imagine this, the creation of Ukrainian art project in post-colonial terms should embrace the previous complexity of the Soviet imperial formation and deal with it. At least, when Tamar suggested that we have some contradictions with Svetlana, whose project I found absolutely fascinating. But we do have this contradiction. So in my view, to deploy Ukrainian label without really problematizing this label is probably the problematic move. I believe that Maidan, for example, was this post-colonial moment in Ukrainian history, both politically and aesthetically and in all other senses, precisely because this was the moment when a kind of a new sense of Ukrainianness has been tested and elaborated by very different people, and they consciously engaged with aesthetic legacy, with memories, in a way that was not determined by, the colonial past. And that's why you see this very, well, for many people, very disturbing, almost really disturbing and dangerous kind of plays with games with, language, with using language from the Second World War and applying those labels and terms to like contemporary movement. But this was really a moment of defamiliarizing, of radical defamiliarizing, and offering a kind of a new vision and a new language of Ukrainianness. And this leads me to my another point, which I think resonates with Tamar comments, that we have to consider ruptures, that writing this longue durée history of lasting colonialism or lasting imperialism, and we already all interpret this differently. We even in our presentations, empires stand for different things in different times and in different places, provincialism versus, the core or whatever. So ruptures are as important as continuity. So we all tend to kind of, when we use those languages of post-colonial, colonial, we all tend to kind of think in these terms of continuities, but ruptures are as important as continuities for, I think, our thinking. Sovereignty is, I agree, it's a key, and especially today, and especially because of the danger of methodological nationalism, and because today we deal with a kind of a, post-national reality. European Union, the problem with migrants, the emergence of this kind of global internet citizenship, and communities that, technically speaking, these people live in their nation states, but in reality they share much more in common with members of their global virtual community than with citizens within their state. And so how does a post-national sovereignty should look like? Should we use some of this analytical language from from the repertoire of people who think about empires in analytical terms, to imagine this may be layered sovereignty, this non-national sovereignty. So this becomes the question if we seriously take, I think, the kind of decolonizing perspective. So I also, like, my last point is also about maybe Svetlana's project where this idea of all people who are in all times who were creating their art in the land of nowadays Ukraine, that they are to be imagined within local contexts, right? So local, this is not national context, but really localized context, because they engage with local cultural subtext, with local material realities, with local imagery. So just, this argument, I think, is quite productive. But it requires this national framework to, I think, then complete your project. Empire as an analytical context, this is to me an illustration. Why do we need empire as an analytical, as agenda, as context setting category? Because if you locate those local, provincial art in what you present today as a kind of Ukrainian national context, this is not necessarily very different from versions of like colonizing accounts. You kind of impose a context externally rather than you try to understand the larger, bigger context with which these people engaged with. There is this excellent book published recently by Alexander Dmitriev and Galina Babak on Ukrainian modernism. And we had a discussion in Ab Imperio with participations of various scholars, including from Ukraine, on this book. And the problem is really about Ukrainian artists engaging with this universalizing and really universal discourse of modernism, and how national vision is a fitting and it even possible within this this framework, whether there was Russian modernism versus Ukrainian modernism versus Georgian modernism and so on and so forth, or there was an inherent conflict in kind of adapting modernism to national ideas and programs. And so to me, this is the most kind of productive approach. So I'll stop here, sorry.
So I want to give our two other speakers a chance to respond to that. We have many questions in the Q&A as well as from YouTube, and I want to invite everybody who's tuned in right now to put their questions in. Unfortunately, we won't be able to answer any of those questions, but the speakers will certainly look at them and consider them. So I'll leave it to Svetlana. Do you want to respond, and then we can get to Ep before we close?
Yes, we have 2 minutes remaining, I think. I hope we can stay a little bit longer. And I will try to be brief. Tamara, responding to your question about post-Soviet space and its dismantling, I wanted to say that if we consider post-Soviet space as a paradigmatic part of post-colonial condition, which I personally consider, we can see these characteristics of ambivalence and hybridity that are imposed on this post-socialist space and post-Soviet space. And countries that belong to it as part of it. And if we think about the colonial situation, which is a shift towards dissolution of this hybridity, and as the colonial theory to which I address mostly in my work sees it, Of course, we can see this very rapid shift to the decolonial situation in 2022 with all this violent nature of all this transformation and change provoked by the full-scale invasion of Russia in Ukraine. And the response that emerged inside Ukraine might look paradoxically as some kind of anti-colonial struggle. That is kind of very radical response and something that can receive probably criticism as an example of, for example, Marina addressed that question was something like short-term radical change which doesn't have consequences. This is not the situation, because the situation mimics the anti-colonial struggle, but what we deal with is a decolonial process of dismantling of this hybrid narrative. Why this confusion emerges, in my opinion, is because there is no kind of proper methodological framework to address the relationship between Russia and Ukraine from perspective of seeing it like a colonial relationship, because current methodologies, being it post-colonial theory, decolonial theory, they address a variety of notions that are not applicable in this particular situation. And for example, if we think about settler colonialism, we can think about syncretism of cultures that create, in these colonial situations, they may create an amalgamation of these cultures. And there is a kind of always internal tension, internal struggle between these elements, which persist in this binary position. In the case of Ukraine and Russia, there is first, there is geographic proximity, there is a shared border. And second, there is cultural proximity. There is pretty much of likeness in, not exact coincidence, but likeness that are difficult to divide into this binary opposition. And this is something that I call the situation that occurs in Ukraine, something that I call syncretic polarization. When there is no proper syncretism because of this difference, you know, that the cultures are proximate to each other, and therefore this polarization is, actualized by this ongoing war, by this ongoing struggle, and there is this, in a way, this kind of, how to say, like a process of distinguishing between these elements that they belong and they don't belong. And so this is kind of artificially made syncretism, but from the other side, it is necessary to distinguish between the two likenesses, which are not the same. So after this very long theorizing, I just want to say that with this polarization, it affects, of course, from local to more regional aspect, and it affects this synthetic entity of post-Soviet space, and sets a precedent for the changes occurring within this post-Soviet space. As, of course, the change between reconsideration of this former centers and former peripheries in what the colonial theory calls colonial matrix of power, how actually these former Soviet and post-Soviet countries, they change their space, their position in this matrix of power. And so that's why I propose that this leads to the dismantling of post-Soviet space that is ongoing now as a concept. Well, and this relates precisely to the idea that I follow to apply this idea of horizontal history of art proposed by Petrovsky, who was not related to this waves of decolonial thinking, but in speaking to these localized narratives and localized context, no, it's not necessarily about speaking about national context. It's not about speaking. It's not speaking about ethnicity. It's not speaking about any kind of local linking to the location or to the place. If we speak about artists, for example, it is about contextualizing, in interpreting in the particular way that delinks from this hierarchy, the colonial hierarchy, and the set of notions that this hierarchy proposes, and post-Soviet space being one of these notions. So I hope I responded to the question.
Yes, we are out of time, and it seems like we could have a couple of more follow-up roundtables with our group only even. A couple of comments from my side. I think one way how to solve many of these methodological problems is always start from very, very concrete material, very local, very concrete material, and then see what happens. And in my case, for example, I looked at Soviet and post-Soviet era different literatures, and I saw that the topic of land was just so dominant everywhere. The question of they coming, also pollution, of course. And my last slide, I showed this, war in Ukraine. I mean, this is about land, right? People are in the trenches. It's just so much right there on the land. So I think we cannot get rid of this very basic category of land. It's very, very substantial. But at the same time, I like the category of eco-social relationships, because this is so much more than just land. And Nancy Krieger's point is that this is even in subcellular level. For example, pollution enters your cells. So you do carry, there's no way to absolutely separate social and ecological, because you just, even in your bodies, these things get intermingled. And perhaps another comment I would like to make in terms of Soviet era, especially one aspect that complicates it. And I mean, I would absolutely stress again my sense of multidirectionality of every society. So yes, of course, we cannot say that colonial label, so to say, solves all the questions. But one of the things that was going on was, of course, 1920s decolonization from the Tsarist empire. So we do have these different labels and different impulses that are being, they are intermingling, they are producing all kinds of interesting controversies, indeed. So we do have in Estonia, for example, 1880s decolonization. Then we have Khrushchev era wave of decolonization. Then we have perestroika decolonization. And so it happens, decolonization happens in waves. And yes, these are really interesting questions to address. And I think I should just finish here. And thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. This was a very, very interesting and exciting panel. And I agree with Ep that we could have gone on for many more panels of this length with us and discussing these questions. And I hope that we have the opportunity to do that in the future. I will leave it to Zuzana to close us off. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamar. By way of closing, let me thank our speakers and members of the audience for joining us today. As a reminder, please consider attending our upcoming session next Friday, February 10th. That conversation will build on today's session by looking at discourses on decolonization from perspectives outside the Anglophone Academy. It will be led by the association's president-elect, Professor Vitaly Chernetsky, with scholars from the Warsaw School of Economics, the the University of Basel and the Lviv Center for Urban History. Have a nice day. Goodbye.